What's up, y'all? You're watching Union Minded, and today we talking about world banks preferring class warfare over financial stability. An article came across my desk today, and based on my simple layman's understanding of labor history, I understand how class war works. And class war has been waged against working people since working people started working and rich people started riching. So this is not new, this is old hat. But it's interesting that the way it's going down now is that the world banks would rather class warfare than financial stability, which also affects a wealthier class of people. So what would be the aim of this? Well, I have no idea. But today, an article came across my desk that was written, or that talks about an economist who predicted the 2008 financial crash when nobody else saw it coming. So I'm reading this for the first time, and I'd like to react to it for you guys. Let's see how it goes. All right, here we go. Marshaled by the U.S. Federal Reserve, central banks around the world have had a unifying philosophy over the past year: bring down inflation no matter the cost, even if it means risking pain for people and businesses. But that approach has been questioned more than ever this month in the wake of several high-profile banking collapses in the US and Europe. Now, a British economist who predicted the 2008 global financial crash has escalated the issue, saying central banks prefer class warfare, or class war, over financial stability. I find it interesting that in the first paragraph, in the first line, in the first sentence, it says marshaled by the U.S. Federal Reserve. Remember that the U.S. Federal Reserve is a bank. It's not part of the government. It's not part of, it is a bank that pretty much has a deal to set up the financial, the way we print money and they print the dollar bills. The Fed is not part of the U.S. government. It's an independent bank. All right. Central banks around the world have had a unifying philosophy. What's a philosophy? A philosophy is a way of life. I said that over the past year, and that was to bring down inflation no matter the cost, even if it hurts people. Now let's go to the next paragraph. The Fed and other central banks have underlined tight labor markets and high wages as key underlying causes behind inflation. But while loosening job markets might help cool down the economy, it also means layoffs, joblessness, and a potential recession, an unacceptable and risky trade-off for some critics present. I'd be a critic and say that that's not okay. But I'm a working person. I tend to have empathy for working people because I know how hard it can be. I come from poverty, so I know how hard that can be. And I also grew up in poverty. And I know that people are people everywhere, man. And we're all just trying to get by. There's good people everywhere, and circumstances a lot of times determine how or what options are available to you, and that's why we got to try to do better. But anyway, of course these are unacceptable things, and it's interesting that the Fed and other central banks are blaming labor markets and high wages. They're not mentioning, and they're not leaning on, the profitization and the greed. Corporations have had upwards of 70% increase in their profit margins over the pandemic. They were jacking up prices because they could. This is well documented, and if you look it up, you'll find articles about this. So it's interesting that the banking wealthy elite do not mention their own greed or their own company's greed, and instead have the audacity to blame how much they're paying workers. So that's old hat. This is an old trick. I'm just trying to pull back the curtain and show you. Civil servants that head up central banks seem willing to sacrifice private banks and global financial stability in their rush to raise rates, crush demand, discipline workers, and shrink the nation's income. Anne Pettifor, a British economist and frequent economic advisor who predicted the 2008 global financial crash with a prescient 2006 book on mounting debt worldwide, wrote in her Substack newsletter Sunday. So this is what she wrote. Civil servants that head up central banks seem willing to sacrifice private banks and global financial stability in their rush to raise rates, to crush demand, and to discipline workers. Disciplining workers. Why are we disciplining workers? And shrink the nation's income. So here's the deal. Workers have had some gains. Workers are now favored by the view of workers, public relation wise. 70% of people have a positive view of unions. So workers are doing good, and the World Bank seem to have an idea that they want to discipline these workers for standing up. Look, I don't care if you right or left on the political spectrum, because that's an illusion anyway. But if you're going to be a Republican, press your people about representing working people on working issues. Press your congressmen, press your senators in those states, press your governors. Why are you letting these folks that suck up to these cats screw you? Why are you letting them do it to you? It's the weakest thing ever. If you're gonna be on that side because you got conservative values, well then, damn it, man, fight for your wages, because they're actively trying to discipline workers that are trying to increase our way of living and our standard of living. So be on that side, but dude, and then if you're a Democrat, and the same token, push your people to represent workers, because how many times do they just give us bluff and gruff and don't show up? Chris Smalls started the Amazon Labor Union in New York, and AOC didn't show up. Not until after he won. We need allies now. So stop thinking everything's cool like this is a culture war. It's not. We're playing checkers. They're playing chess. And until we play chess, we're going to lose this game. I've got videos that I come across of electricians that won't even mention that they're union electricians. That won't sit there and go, I'm an IBEW electrician. That won't even talk about union meetings on their videos. That won't even talk about the union at all and what union life is. These folks that run the world financial system, they're coming for all workers. All of them. And we ain't got the same level of workers as the French workers. Over in France, those elitists, the powerful, they're afraid of the working people over there, because the working people over there stand up for themselves together, and they care about each other together on a more fundamental, instinctual level, to the point that they put the differences aside and say, hey, they coming for us. Forget left and right. It's up and down time. Let's go get it. We've been here, and yet we still doing this. It's you, it's you, it's you, it's you. No, it's them. It's right here in black and white. This economist predicted the 2008 financial crash in 2006 with her book. I mean, she was writing it in 2005. She saw it coming. But I'm sorry, man, I'm hot. That's just wrong. In other words, their effective preference is for class war over financial stability. Hard to face up to what central bankers are doing. Silicon Valley Bank has taken its fair share of criticism for its collapse earlier this month, with many slamming its management. But the Fed also had a role to play in its downfall. Remember, again, the Fed is not part of the U.S. government. The Fed has been accused of blocking any phrasing about regulatory blunders that may have led to the bank's collapse when the government announced SVB's rescue. SVB's failure was also tied to its assets losing value over the past year, as the Fed abruptly shifted away from a near zero interest rate environment. Remember when the Fed was going to jack interest rates because it was at 0% for so long and they needed to slow the economy down? They did it to discipline workers. They didn't care if you were Republican or a Democrat. They did it to come for those who work 5 days a week. You and me. We got to be smarter than this, guys, gals, siblings. We got to be smarter than this. Working people, we got to be smarter than this. Whew. All right. Let me pick up where I left off. They made SVB particularly vulnerable in a liquidity crisis, and other banks are in a similar position. So what is this doing? This is actually causing a financial crash. The fact is, remember Occupy Wall Street? I'm sorry, that was a tangent. Back to the article. The fact is, I found it hard to face up to what central bankers are doing, not just by raising rates, suppressing demand, and lowering wages, Pettifor wrote. Through lack of analysis, regulation, oversight, and foresight, central bankers have shown this week they were prepared to use high rates to risk and even precipitate bank failures and global financial instability. If you don't think this is a class war, you're not really receiving the information that would allow you to come to this conclusion. It's so plain in front of our face that it only needs you to look at it. It's like a spilled soda on a white carpet and all you have to do is look down. We're gonna get this, man. We're gonna get this. She also called the European Central Bank. She also criticized the European Central Bank for sticking to large rate hikes last week, despite the recent bank collapses in the U.S. Credit Suisse failed just days later and was bought by USB in an emergency deal brokered by regulators. Pettifor went on to reference an interview between former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and comedian and political commentator Jon Stewart. Wait a minute. Pettifor went on to reference an interview between former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and comedian and political commentator Jon Stewart that aired last week. Summers insisted that raising rates and tackling inflation at all costs was the right way forward, while Stewart challenged him on the outsized role corporate profits have played in fueling inflation, which has received comparable little attention from the Fed. I saw that pieces of that interview, and it's golden. I'm sure you've seen it too. Pain to workers and lower income groups has been depicted as a necessary evil in the battle to reduce inflation by Fed Chair Jerome Powell and other prominent economists like Summers. But the approach of targeting the labor market to reduce inflation has also been widely criticized around the world. The Bank of England's Governor Andrew Bailey was slammed last year for asking British businesses to practice restraint in pay raise negotiations. More recently in the US, Powell's method has been blasted for causing financial instability with this month's banking crisis and ultimately placing the burden of reducing inflation on workers' shoulders. It's always us that pays the cost. It's always us that pays the cost. And if you're not hearing any of this type of language from your electeds, they're failing you. We are under attack currently. Currently, this is happening. And if we're not smarter than that and out there organizing to beat this nonsense back, then we're not effectively leading the union movement. We're not effectively doing our jobs and our duty to uphold our oaths. Read your Constitution. It stands for something. Either that or this is all just a hoax. Pettifor isn't the only voice critical of central banks' policies. Political figures in the U.S., mainly on the progressive left, including Senator Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, have also criticized Powell and the Fed for risking driving the economy into a recession and casting millions into unemployment. Warren has been at the forefront of attacks, saying Sunday that Powell had failed at his job and should no longer be chair. She has long been critical of Powell for the risks high interest rates pose to the labor market, warning earlier this month that the Fed could put as many as 2 million Americans out of work by the end of its current tightening cycle. And do you think that's fair at all? You think there's going to be a wealthy person that loses their home? Do you think there's going to be anybody that's wealthy that's going to be affected by this? No, but you know brothers and sisters who are going to be affected by this. Regardless of what union you're a part of, or regardless of where you work, or even if you're a non-union working person. You know it as well as I do. Working people are going to be affected by this, and you're probably going to know somebody that gets hurt by this. 2 million people is a lot. Raising interest rates, hikes, and slowing down the economy tends to hit employees the hardest, especially low-wage ones, by triggering layoffs and slowing down wage growth. Higher interest rates will harm millions of workers who will be involuntarily drafted into the inflation fight by losing jobs or long overdue pay raises, Robert Reich, former U.S. Labor Secretary, wrote in an op-ed for The Guardian last year, shortly before the Fed began its tightening cycle. To be sure, inflation has been a driving concern for Americans since last year, often more so than any other issues. Last month, 13% of Americans cited inflation as their biggest current concern, while only 1% mentioned wage issues. It's funny how when I tell you we're propagandized, I mean it. How is it that such a high percentage talks about inflation, and never ever mentions that we have a wage issue? We are so out of touch, and we blame poor people for all of our problems. We're programmed to blame poor people for all of our problems because that's what the media does. Whenever there's a problem, stimulus checks went out to everybody, but what did they do? They started complaining, poor people, poor people, poor people. Meanwhile, tax cuts and all the breaks go to the very rich. Poor people ain't the problem. It's the imbalance of the system that's the problem. And until we start getting together and realizing what's going on, that it's actually on purpose, it's class warfare, and they're doing it on purpose, and you're aiding and abetting evil, greedy bastards. Yeah, you're aiding and abetting evil, greedy bastards when you don't support working issues, when you're not hip to the game, when you don't support your union, when you don't help to make your union a better place. And I know I'm preachy. Let me get off my soapbox, right? Because I don't know, maybe it touches something in your soul and makes you feel guilty, but maybe you should feel guilty. Anywho, to be sure, inflation has been a driving concern for Americans since 1% mentioned wage issues. Inflation has been a heavy burden for Americans of all income levels since prices began creeping up in 2021. It's been particularly painful for low and middle income Americans who have had to dip deep into their savings to cope with soaring food, energy, and housing prices. Inflation has been hard for high earners too, as more than half of high income Americans are now living paycheck to paycheck. You think this isn't an effort to drive people out of being high income and have them forced to live in paycheck to paycheck and hope an emergency happens so that you lose out on everything? You think this ain't a plot? We just got to be smarter about what we're doing. The fight isn't left and right, it's up and down. I tell you this all the time. But the Fed's focus on inflation and especially on labor market tightness, which Wharton professor Jeremy Siegel earlier this month called monomaniacal, say that 7 times fast, may be ignoring some important points behind rising prices. A 2022 study from the left-leaning Economic Policy Institute found that over half of price increases for goods and services could be attributed to larger profit margins among corporations, while only 8% of the inflation was tied to higher labor costs. See, they were lying the whole time. They were blaming labor and they were blaming workers' pay rates going up. But in reality, it was being driven by corporations' abuse of a pandemic and a situation. They took advantage of a bad situation and took advantage of it and jacked their prices up and caused all of it. Siegel told CNBC this month that since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, worker wages have been rising more slowly than inflation, and it was hard to argue that labor costs were the main contributor to inflation. Thank you. On the Fed's larger inflation vision, some economists, including Mohamed El-Erian, have argued that its 2% goal is outdated and reaching it would lead to severe economic harm, while a higher stable inflation rate around 3 to 4% might be more appropriate. Again, this is them arguing that we need to raise inflation to stymie workers, to stymie the economy, which then stymies workers. This is all them trying to keep their share of the profits. It is unclear if the recent banking failures and pleadings from the left have swayed Powell from his commitment to bring down inflation no matter the cost. Although Fed officials will provide clarity on their direction when they meet Wednesday to discuss the size of the next interest rate hike. This story was originally featured on Fortune.com. Well, there you have it. You got world banks that work in the same industry as the Fed, right? This is all the world banking system, right? And the Fed is marshaling the policy of class warfare. And we're busy fighting over crap that doesn't matter. Because it's the paycheck issues that are going to hurt you. not somebody going to a bathroom that you don't agree they should go to. Anyway, if you stuck around this long, man, thanks. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, drop some comments, ring the notification bell. And let's be smarter. It's chess, not checkers. The fight's not left and right, it's up and down. It's going to take class solidarity to win always. Each one teach one, get out there and reach one, and remember there can be no union without you and I, front and center. Peace.